He has a child. Hello? Okay. I wanted to do a quick sound check. Joseph and Pooja, can you hear me?
Yes, Katarzyna. Hi, how are you? Can you
Okay, this is great. Thank you so much for joining today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. Hope everything is fine with you and the team.
Yes, absolutely. Everything is really nice. And we are very happy that you had the chance to join us today. And also you, Joseph, you can also see the other little video on the screen. That's our third panelist and the head of our department here in geography at Cambridge. So you can kind of informally get to know each other. We're about to start a little bit after 2 because people are all, there's this waiting room function. So you have to be letting people in slowly. So possibly at 5 past, we will start the seminar. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
That's good.
That's fine.
Okay, this is great. So I'm going to stop my video for now, yeah, and then I will reconnect with you at 5 past. Stay on, okay?
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Hello. Okay. I hope you can all hear me. Welcome. Welcome everyone. It is now 5 past. We will slowly begin. Some people are still in the waiting room, so we will be admitting them as we go. But for now, welcome to the Cambridge Geography Seminar Series, Geographies of Work in the Pandemic and Beyond. Many thanks for joining us today. I'm Katarzyna. I'm a research associate here in Cambridge Geography, and I will be chairing today's session. Before we begin, we need to inform you that we're going to record both the audio and the video of the session, and this recording will then be available for viewing on the Cambridge Geography website. So if you don't wish to be recorded, please refrain from using your audio video during the session. A couple of rules for today. Please keep your camera and microphone switched off when the panel starts, with the exception of the panelists. And the purpose is to minimize noise in the call. We want this session to be as interactive as possible. So feel free to ask the questions in the chat at any time, starting now. We really want a vibrant discussion there. And in the last 20 minutes of the session, you will also have the chance to ask a question with your audio. We'll open up the floor for questions and comments. And when asking those, please be considerate and respectful with your language. So the Cambridge Department of Geography is convening a research program on decent work and youth livelihoods in response to the growing crisis of unemployment and working poverty in lower and middle income countries. And the COVID-19 pandemic has caused serious disruptions across the world in various dimensions of life. The realm of work, however, has emerged as a particularly contentious area of discussion. So we take this as an opportunity to ask, how has the pandemic reinforced or challenged our understanding of work, working lives and livelihoods? In this 4-part seminar series, we take the value chains, environment today, technology and civic potency as the anchoring themes to engage with this question. And the topic for today's session is work and environment. The early analysis of the impacts of the pandemic stressed the sharp contrast between economic and livelihood losses and environmental gains. These relate mainly to the secondary impacts of the pandemic, such as the lockdown and the mass internal migration that it triggered in a number of developing countries, termed urbanization in reverse, as income-deprived urban workers return to their home villages. So while some researchers see this COVID challenge as an opportunity to achieve a green transition, others point to the shifting priorities in donor fighting, away from sustainable or green or circular economies and towards fast economic recovery. So there's a plethora of topics to engage here, and today we have 3 distinguished panelists to offer their insights. A few words about them. We've got Pooja Shakya, is a consultancy delivery lead on climate and resilience at Practical Action Consulting Nepal, working on disaster risk reduction and climate change, and specializing in disaster resilience, livelihoods, and gender. She has extensive field experience working with grassroots and a substantial practical and conceptual knowledge of gender issues in natural resource management, particularly in relation to climate change adaptation. Pooja has also worked on a number of projects focusing on community development and livelihoods in the context of hydrological risk reduction and resilience to flooding and landslides. Most recently, Fuja has been involved in a citizen science project in Western Nepal, which also provides us with a very interesting bridge to the academia. Now, Joseph Avatoriero is a professor of geography and the director of the Regional Institute for Population Studies at the University of Ghana. Joseph's research interests are at the intersection of development studies and rural geography. He has been doing research in rural northern Ghana since 1999, focusing on environmental issues, poverty, food insecurity, and sustainable rural livelihoods. He has also published extensively on the topic of land tenure, transnational land deals, and climate change adaptation in agrarian contexts. Joseph has worked closely with the Ghanaian Ministry of Lands, Forestry, and Mines, as well as the Statistical Office, the World Bank, and many other development agencies. Bhaskar Vira is a professor of political economy and head of geography department at the University of Cambridge and the founding director of the Cambridge Conservation Research Institute. His work brings a critical political economy perspective to contemporary debates in relation to ecosystem services, natural capital, and the values of nature for human well-being. He has over 25 years of experience working on conservation, environment, livelihoods, and other development issues in India, and has published extensively both in peer-reviewed journals and in popular press. Many thanks again to our panelists for joining us today. And I would like to invite you to share your insights on the topic of our today's seminar, Work Environment in the Light of COVID-19. And I'd like to start with Pooja, if that's okay. So please, Pooja, unmute your microphone.
Okay, thank you so much, Katarzyna. And namaste to all who are presented here. So namaste from Kathmandu, and it's late evening here. Yeah, I think the topic that you shared today for the discussion is very much interesting, particularly or personally for me, because this work and environment in this COVID context is very much related, and how I would say, like, since I'm working in the development sector, like in disaster and climate change, I have been working from home since past 5 months. So, a development professional who has been working or who has devoted her several years in working for the environment is working from home. So how this COVID, this pandemic has affected the professionals like us. However, having said this particular, this pandemic has not affected our working strategies or working ways, and also not affected, how we are involving with the communities and the helping them to build the resilience in this current situation, as well as in some disasters like landslides and floods in which I'm working. So for this discussion, I'm very much, or I look forward to have some more insights and suggestions, and also from recommendations from other panelists as well as the participants on how this could be improved. I already said that I'm taking working from home as an opportunity, being a woman, like I have my family and all, and I got this opportunity to stay at home, work together with my child and my family. However, this has also impacted on my enthusiasm, my workforce, to go to the field and help and work directly with them at the field when this monsoon periods, especially during this COVID situation. It was the monsoon period here in Nepal, and floods and landslide. We were slightly affected to work on those areas or those needed people, like that. So I found this work and environment topic very much interesting to discuss here. Katarzyna, thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope to discuss more with the all other panelists as well as the participants, to share some of my personal as well as professional knowledge or experience during this COVID situation, and likewise about my experience, past experience as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I move on to our next panelist, could I ask you whether you have had any insights about how people are actually coping in the area where you work? Right? Because these are mostly people who rely on land for their livelihoods. How is it your life changed? How has it been impacted because of the limitations, but because of also of all the family members returning from urban areas? If you have had any voices, any contact, if you could share.
Mhm. Yeah, sharing about how the people are coping in this situation. I would like to share the experience from two different perspectives, like from urban and rural. Because since I'm based here in Kathmandu, it's a capital city of Nepal. It's a bit different how people are coping here. I'd like to share their experience. I mean, the knowledge that I've again from this during this period. The people here have adapted themselves to work virtually. So development professionals like us are working virtually. We have been conducting online workshops. Even the group works, we have been doing such kind of works. And not only that, that's the work perspective. Another is agriculture perspective. Like the people here in urban areas now have realized the importance of agriculture. Like the terrace farming is really becoming famous in Kathmandu. Even the local government, Kathmandu Metropolitan and Lalitpur Metropolitan, has distributed the free seed fertilizers for this terrace farming. People are really interested on that. And another is the urban youths, who like the people before this pandemic are not really much interested on online businesses or online transaction. However, due to this COVID situation, youth, especially the urban youths, are more interested or involved in this online transaction, mostly for the this daily activities, like for example for food, for their clothes, anything, even for medicine or doctor services kind of thing, health services. So this is how the people are coping with this changing environment. And also, like if we talk about the rural context, this is a bit different. Like this is not this kind of easy situation there. As you all know that we have a very we are developing country. We have we do not have that highly economic condition here in case of rural context, as well as also in urban as well. So the people there are coping with their agricultural lands. They are not taking care of this COVID situation or COVID corona's safety and security measures. So there the people are not taking it as seriously as how the urban people are taking it as. However, we are also dependent on the this migration remittances. So we do have many youths, like most of the youths who are abroad, not just in the, foreign countries, also in the neighboring countries like India. So it's a very easy for the youth migrants to travel to India. And during the early days of the lockdown situation or this corona, people who were migrated to India travel back to Nepal. That's mostly for the rural context, and also in the southern plains of Nepal. So then after the second stage of this lockdown, because due to this situation, the agriculture production markets have been affected, mostly affected. So the people started starving, not starving, but they do not get enough food to have. So they again migrated back to India. In some recent cases, this is a very interesting case for us. Like even though we are having this kind of cases, like extreme cases of or increasing cases of corona or COVID, the people are traveling back to India. And the statement that they said, or reported to the news, is like that: we do not care about health, we care about our stomach, our hunger. So this is very you know sad statement that people of rural areas, or let's say the southern plains, who are dependent on the dependent to India for their jobs and their livelihoods, are how they are doing this. Like it's mostly like coping. I would say they are coping to the current situation, because government has somewhat not, they blame that government has not listened to their request about their coping strategies as well. And also to the agriculture, in the agriculture sector, like in the recent news during the COVID or the lockdown situation, many farmers they just throw away their agricultural products to the streets. They this because of they do not get the market value they received, and also they do not get any subsidies for the transportation, and also transport to from production to the market areas. So these were the very sensitive cases that we heard during the lockdown situation, that were mostly from the rural areas. For urban, the people are coping, because they can cope because of some of the situations or the economic conditions that they can maintain till now. But the frustration, the mental health, that's beyond, I think after few days or few weeks, that will be beyond the control here. I would say that the people at this level or at this stage, they are coping, but that really differs from urban to rural sector of Nepal. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Pooja, for this very, very dramatic testimony on what the situation is like in Nepal. Lives or livelihoods. We've seen this headline on the World Bank blog. Very, very, very dramatic. I do hope we will have the time later to return to you and ask some gender-related questions. But for now, I would like to invite Professor Joseph Yarrow to share his perspective on any of the issues related to work and environment in the times of Corona and beyond.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks once again for having me here. I will provide my perspective by contextualizing it, providing the Ghanaian side of the story. In Ghana, I'm sure you've all heard about Ghana's president's most famous quote on Corona, when he said earlier on in the year in March that we know how to bring the economy back to life. What we do not know is how to bring people back to life. Following this statement, a 3-week lockdown was imposed on the major cities of Accra, Kumasi, Tema, Kaswa. But however, there were checks, police and military checks all over the country, which created a situation whereby movement became quite cumbersome, both for people and for goods. Though after 3 weeks, the lockdown was lifted, or partial lockdown was lifted, but however, we still had certain measures that were put in place to prevent the spread of the disease. And these included limits on number of people who can be present at a gathering. This included the suspension of schools, the closure of schools and universities. It also included a reduction in number of people who could be in vehicles, in buses, closure of nightclubs and restaurants. And as you know, majority of people in the urban areas, in emerging or in low-level economies, mainly operate within the informal sector, which is dominated to a large extent also by local restaurants. The food sector is a huge employer of people. Traditional markets are the major sources of employment that you have in developing countries. And all these are the areas, the geographical spaces of work where COVID-19 hit most and where government policy tends to bite more. So, what has been the immediate impacts of these measures on work life and on life generally? When we take the measures that include closing of schools and universities, suspension of gatherings over 25, partial lockdowns in urban areas, what we find is that the emerging social distance measures that are being put have created a situation whereby, at least at the beginning when we had lockdowns, more than half of the population in the informal sector lost their jobs. Also, up to a quarter of people living in major cities that were affected tried to migrate back home to rural areas because they couldn't survive without food. I mean, we call those people living hand to mouth. And hand to mouth meant that you lived on your daily wage. The highest number of days it can take you will be 3 days. So many of these had to return back. Unfortunately, for many of them, they were caught up by the deadline for moving. Therefore, there was no transport to get people out. And destitution certainly comes in. The literature is full of the assertion that COVID does not affect everyone the same way. It depends on social class, depends on the nature of the town or city in which you live, depending on whether it is a densely populated area or sparsely populated area, whether it's rural or urban. Now, what we find is that initially we all thought that the urban areas were going to be the worst hit. But then it didn't take long for us to realize that the repercussions that had vibrated through the whole value chain system began to bite rural people. Why? Because we still have majority of food coming from these rural supply chains. And the supply chain has several people employed, right from the farmer, the laborer, the aggregator, the transporter, through to the distributors, big distributors and small distributors and petty traders. And beyond that, people who provide services along this chain, such as carriers, people who carry and help customers who are buying these foods. The whole of this chain was thrown into disarray. So as a result, the informal sector became basically dysfunctional. Now, formal workplaces happen to be much more different because these are formalized by contracts, and therefore people's incomes, salaries cannot just be cut anyhow. So you have government workers having the greatest security of work and income. And for many of these, they could stay at home and work. For others, they stayed at home and did no work and yet got paid. But for majority in the informal sector, that wasn't the situation. And even here, we can differentiate between two groups of people. You have the formal sector that has both government and some non-government work environments, such as companies. And for many companies, we experience cuts in salaries and even some redundancies where people were asked to go home. And I do understand, listening to the radio, that for many employees, they never got their jobs back. It looks like COVID was used as a cover, a smoke screen to get rid of some people from company payrolls who are not being called back. Though the COVID situation is not that bad in Ghana, given the low death toll and hospitalization situation, Ghana still takes the measures very seriously. Now, one of those measures has to do with the transport sector. And the transport sector had to reduce the number of occupants in a vehicle. By reducing the number of occupants simply meant that the profits to transport operators went down. Reacting to this means they increased transport fares. In urban Ghana, transport fares constitutes what people call the killer. So for whatever job you do, your income is low and you do not want transport fares above $1 affecting you. But COVID-19 has made transport fares jump in most instances to more than $1.25 for someone going from home to work and back home. But pre-COVID had probably around 60 cents for such low income earners. Then also, during the period of lockdown, You had a situation whereby the poorest did not earn much, but still had to live. How did they do this? I mean, it was surprising for some interviews I conducted. I was shocked to realize that most poor people actually do not cook food anymore. They all buy food. Why? Because they are out the whole day. So there's nothing like cooking food. So during the lockdown for 3 weeks, you now have to learn the art or come to terms with cooking food yourselves. And they are not used to keeping stores, reserves of food compared to the middle class who are able to do so. During the lockdown, most middle classes who are employed were able to go to shops and stock their houses of at least 50 to 100 kilos of rice. The poor who live on the informal market were not able to do this. For many of them, they actually borrowed money later only to meet price hikes. The prices of commodities rose just 1 week after the lockdown, either as a result of scarcity or as a result of hoarding or as a result of high excessive demand for these. So basically, we can see that the urban area took the biggest hit. But however, far away in the hinterlands, the lockdown also posed some considerable challenge. One, perishable food items were destroyed. We spoke to some farmers last 2 weeks, and they talked about big farmers who had cultivated 3 acres of watermelon, losing everything because no truck was willing to cart them to the major cities because they had no buyers. Beyond that, the cost of transport had skyrocketed in spite of the low fuel prices. That's strange. Why? Because the amount of security checks that the government had put on the roads to control movement of people and enforce COVID rules had led to loss of extortion on the roads. Thereby, the cost of a truck moving for 700 kilometers in terms of bribes came close to half of the fuel cost of that movement. And beyond that, they did not have people to buy the melons or tomatoes when they got to the urban centers because people are locked up in their houses and were dependent on tomato puree instead of buying fresh fruits. And this same situation applies to banana producers, to orange producers, to all the perishable items that you can talk about. Beyond that, this happened in March and April. That is the beginning of the planting season for many farmers. And for many farmers, their villages would normally have just one tractor, and they have to depend on tractor operators who move from other regions because the seasons are different. So therefore, you have tractors who will move between the different agroecological zones. And these tractors could not move because of restrictions. So as a result, you also had many poor people who do not own their own equipment not being able to plant on time. And for many of them, it is a disaster because they planted late. Unfortunately, our neighbor Burkina Faso, as a result of climate change, they have a big dam called the Bagri Dam, and the Bagri Dam is overflowing. As a result, it's being spilled. For the past 3 weeks, the whole of the northeastern part of Ghana, which is probably around 14% of landmass of Ghana, is flooded. So it means that all farmers who were not able to plant on time have got their peanuts, they have got their rice, they have got their maize submerged underwater as we speak. Had it not been for COVID, many of these farmers would have harvested a month ago and therefore would not find themselves in this situation. So therefore, it becomes difficult to talk about COVID having a larger impact on only urban areas because it takes a much direct hit. In rural areas, this has been the biggest problem that we have. It's indirect, but much more terrible since majority are poor. Now let's look at some environmental aspects. For most of what I hear from the rest of the world, I mean, pollution is said to have gone down in terms of atmospheric. Yes, in Accra, we did enjoy some nice clean air within the 3 weeks. Why? Because we have very few vehicles. Also, Accra's major problem is dust. All the huge tipper trucks and industrial machines that are digging out gravel and sand for construction cease. But however, we are back to where we started. The tipper trucks are back and the construction machines are hitting everywhere. In terms of energy, majority of Ghanaians still use charcoal for food. During the lockdown and after, charcoal production went down. But however, because charcoal prices rose as a result of lockdown measures, people are now back into the forest and probably are harvesting much more wood than they did earlier on in order to benefit from the increase in prices of charcoal. Similarly, timber products also had low demand during that period because construction people were not roofing their houses. That is up again. Although already Ghana has a timber deficit because we buy most of our timber now from Western Ivory Coast, and now most Ghanaian forest is under threat because the demand for timber products for roofing and for carpentry is above the roof. It's surprising how a pandemic can create the deflation in an economy and at the same time create an inflation within a short period of 3 months. For the gold, because of high gold prices, the government and other stakeholders didn't really take any measures to control the production of gold, and gold mines have been working as usual. Illegal miners have taken advantage of the situation, and despite a ban on illegal mining, small scale mining, really many people, commentators have argued that it was during the period of COVID that the most damage has been caused in Ghanaian forest zone as the rivers have become muddy and red all of a sudden. I guess I have spoken a lot and I will reserve most of what I have to say for the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating insights. I really find it striking how both you and Pooja kind of stress that even though we tend to think about urban and rural populations as disconnected, the virus, the pandemics and its repercussions made us realize how very much connected these issues are, how very much connected these populations still are, be it through transport services, broken value chains, or any other means. For the sake of time, we're going to move to Professor Vera for now, and we will reconnect with you in a moment, okay?
Great, thank you very much, Katarzyna, for that. And also to my fellow panelists who've already said so much, which is so fascinating. I really look forward to being able to discuss that in a bit more detail. So just to sort of set some context, I'm currently based in Cambridge, but I will be speaking mostly from my experience of what's happening in India. I have to say I've been in the UK now, it's slightly over 30 years, and this is the longest period that I've gone without visiting India, mostly because of the lockdown and my inability to visit. So with apologies, that I know there are a number of people who are more locally based, who are probably better placed to speak about firsthand experience of what's happening in India. I do apologize for kind of representing this from the UK, but I have been following with colleagues, with friends, closely what is happening in the Indian context. So I'll try and bring that into the conversation. Much of it resonates very strongly with what Pooja has talked about from the Nepalese context, what Professor Yaro has talked about from Ghana. So many of these issues that you've already mentioned have been reported from the Indian context as well. Just a bit of sort of background and context. India had its severe lockdown at the end of March. But as people who are following the news probably can see, that the surge of cases reported in India continues. India now has the second highest number of positive cases behind the United States. I think it's approaching 5 million confirmed cases as we speak. It's on the high end of 4.8 million. And at the same time, slowly the lockdown has been opening up. So, you know, activity is resuming, and obviously that brings with it further risks in terms of disease transmission. I suppose one of the patterns that people are talking about is that what started in the large metropolitan cities is now extending into smaller towns, as well as in the rural areas. And of course, there are specific and significant challenges associated with that, both in terms of testing capacity, in terms of health services. Um, but this isn't really the focus of what we are talking about today. So I'll just pass on that just as a contextual uh, situation in India. Um, I'll pick up on a few of the issues that colleagues have already talked about. And, Professor Yarrow talked about the unexpected benefits of economic slowdown in terms of people reporting blue skies for the first time in Delhi. And I'm sorry not to have seen that myself, because every time I visit Delhi, I'm not given that lovely opportunity. The impact, obviously, of the types of activity that were described, of a lower vehicular transport, of less construction, and therefore less dust, less haze. Um, Essentially, what we know well, which is that pollution, especially urban air pollution, is very directly linked with the scale of economic activity. If you enter into a period of severe lockdown, then economic activity does reduce, and that has um, predictable impacts in terms of the improvements in environmental quality. But of course, what we know is that that's not sustainable. And as recovery takes place, if you go back to the old ways of doing business, then you could expect that there would be a return to traffic congestion, to pollution, and all the other challenges that people are very familiar with. But the main insight, obviously, is that there was a very direct evidence from around the world that our consumption and production processes clearly are driving some of these environmental quality issues that people confront, especially in the large cities. And a reduction of those consumption and production processes can very quickly result in a turnaround in some of those conditions. Um, People in the Indian plains reported seeing Himalayan views for the first time. So, Pooja, I don't think people were seeing Kathmandu from Delhi, but they were talking about the Himalayas suddenly being visible in that spring summer period in ways that they had never seen in their lifetime. So, there were all these unexpected positive benefits. I want to focus a little bit more, though, on the environmental consequences and some of the questions that are already being talked about. So, a bit like reported from other places, the immediate impact was visibly manifested in terms of the impact on migrant labor. The scale of that was probably huge and under expected in India, but not surprising when you think about the way in which people make a living these days. Large numbers of migrants, often in urban jobs, which are precarious in the way that Professor Yarrow described, people making a living just by earning enough to feed themselves for the next 2 or 3 days, suddenly finding that those forms of livelihood were snatched away because work suddenly came to a standstill. They then found themselves far away from home, because these were often migrants who traversed large distances in search of work, and also not necessarily able to find their way back because of transport lockdown. So some very distressing reports over this period of exactly the impact on the urban migrant, who have, of course, with great difficulties now started to make their way back to what they regard as a place of relative safety, which is the home villages and towns that they came from. Um, but having made their way back, there is a desire to try and make a living. And how do you make a living when there is no work? So I think there's been a huge amount of distress in that context. Now, in the Indian case, we have a large and well-established social security scheme called the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. And of course, having something as a rural safety net to provide jobs on demand does help to take some pressure off. And the NREGS saw a surge in demand over the months of May and June. That came down a little bit in July and a little bit further in August as things have started opening up. The government was forced to increase the allocation of resources to the NREGS, but there is a worry that there may not be sufficient revenue to continue to invest in the NREGS, and there's a real desire to ensure that as a social safety net does continue to provide at least something that provides a means of livelihood for uh, people who find themselves in these distressing situations. So I think that's something that I want to come back to, which is not just the need for investment in public support of that sort, but also how can that be directed in potentially more pro-environmental work? Can the fact that we have such a large public works program effectively actually go towards greening some of that NREGS work? Um, I wanted to comment a little bit on the impact of restricted movement on access. So, in particular, access to the forests in parts of the country where the rural poor continue to rely on access to the forest for things like fuel wood, but also for things like access to wild foods. And restrictions on movement coupled with restrictions on access to the forest did mean that during that season, when agricultural production was low and access to the forest might have provided a very valuable safety net for what are often called non-timber forest products that are part of people's livelihood strategies as well as people's consumption strategies, became much more restricted. And that, of course, has potential consequences on things like community-based conservation efforts because people are unable to move around in these rural areas. Coming to the question of the future and what kinds of changes might the impact of the pandemic have on the way in which we reorient production, consumption, work opportunities. People talk a lot about green jobs. People talk about trying to find these green growth pathways that are both pro-environmental, reset the economy, but reset the economy in a sort of environmentally friendly way. Um, and what are these green jobs likely to look like? Now, of course, when you're talking about ecosystems, the restoration of ecosystems, the creation or the recreation of wetlands, of tanks for irrigation, of forests, these are labor-intensive activities. So in some senses, environmental restoration or environmental protection activity lends itself very well to job creation. It's a labor-intensive activity. And an obvious win here is trying to combine some of the positives of having something like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme by also linking it to local rural works that are able to support some of these environmental assets. Again, reading reports, there have been some fantastic stories. A story I was reading just the other day from a district in central India called Jhansi. 11,000 migrant workers who returned to the state because of the coronavirus-induced lockdown have been put to work through the NREGS in reviving local ponds in the district. So you're actually investing that rural employment scheme towards the revitalization of local environmental assets in places where this is needed. So absolutely, there is the potential to try and combine the creation of work in local areas with the environmental needs that those local areas might have. And those are likely to be quite labor intensive, but hard work. And I keep saying when people point to the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, this is not white collar office employment. This is out there working very hard in tough conditions, better than no work, but it's not necessarily work that is appealing that everybody would necessarily want. And there have been some very interesting stories as well of people who've gone back to their home villages from white collar jobs and have been forced through destitution, through need, to actually take up hard manual labor as the only way of getting some work. So we need to be aware that while it's helpful to have those sorts of social security networks, it isn't necessarily work that's appealing to everyone. So really looking forward, and I'm going to try and quickly conclude, if we are going to reboot the economy and we're going to talk about the big reset, we need to think about what these new economic structures are going to look like. In particular, it's very easy for technology to drive a labor saving process of growth. And can we think about ways in which the future will actually be demanding increased labor rather than reducing the demand for labor? We need to create structures that generate new types of jobs. And then to think about whether we have people with the skills that those new types of jobs need. So it's not just about restoration work or manual work out in the rural areas. if this technological transformation requires a development of a skill base that allows people to be involved in things like solar energy, that requires people to be involved in these new industries of the future, the 21st century economy, do we have locally the skill set to enable people to actually take advantage of those new green industries? Or is it going to be that those green industries will be dominated by a very small subset of well qualified, well skilled, urban based workers? So these are things that we need to discuss and debate. I know we're running out of time, so I'd better stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this. We have some questions and comments coming from the chat section. So if you want to, please do also post your question or comment there. One of them has to do with community-based conservation, right? Conservation efforts that have been compromised as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the lockdown. We have people taking advantage, poaching going on in Nepal. That's a comment from Binod Parujuli. A very interesting observation, especially that we are thinking in terms of conservation, mainly as shifting donor funding, right? So it is going away from conservation efforts towards livelihoods. But in fact, there are also much more direct consequences like poaching. Another question from Alejandra that has to do with looking into the future. And I think we should maybe focus on that. If I could ask all of my panelists to briefly comment. Alejandra from Peru is asking about particular measures that could be undertaken to enable a green or greener transition, if at all you think possible in your context of professional expertise. And I think we could include both national initiatives here, but also some work at the grassroots, if you could comment on that. Green transitions, looking into the future. Could I ask Pooja to comment?
Yeah, Katarzyna, yes. So if you talk about Nepal, yeah, like for the green transition or green recovery, I think in Nepal we are very much, doing very good or well in this community-based forestry. So during this lockdown also, like we have been reported that there were very less number of poaching, because due to the restriction in the mobility of the people and also of the poachers. So not only that, the people are also encouraged in some of the conservative or conservation activities in their locality or in their area. And apart from that, people now have thought or of being self-sustained, like through the agriculture sector. Like they are now encouraged in involving in the agriculture sector. And government in Nepal has recently been published some of the calls on how the migrant workers could be used for this green economy activities or kind of things. Like for example, they are encouraging the youths, especially the migrant workers from mostly from this India, India returning migrants. They are encouraging those migrants to be involved in maybe enterprise based agriculture as well. So from these things, like government is also thinking of involving and utilizing their skill sets in those kind of activities for this green economy, as well as in encouraging the people who have those kind of skill set knowledge that they have gained from abroad, to be utilized in sustainable way in those kind of activities and areas. So not only forest sectors, the people are now that I also would like to highlight one thing here is we have been very much affected. Like the tourism sector in Nepal has been very much affected by this situation or this pandemic. So the people now are also, those people are also now thinking of alternative ways, like, I already said that agriculture, they are taking agriculture as the most opportunistic way that they can be involved. So the tourism sector, in the tourism sector, I think for next 6 or 8 months or a year, this will not be as regular as that it used to be before. So the people are now thinking of how, the organic farming could be encouraged in the villages or in rural context, and so that the urban or the returning migrants could be used or could be utilized, or they use their skills for those kind of activities. And I'm very much glad that not only the in the rural context, in the urban context also, the people, especially the youths, they are much more into including the new technologies, like the new technologies as such, like online businesses, together with the agriculture sector, linking that with the rural areas, like creating the value chain and the supply chain, and then creating the jobs from those areas, rural to the urban areas. So this is how it's getting in the context of Nepal.
Thank you very much, Pooja. Professor Yarrow, Joseph, can you share your perspective? Is green or greener recovery, green transition possible for Ghana? What kind of enabling policies would you envision?
Thank you. The question of a green transition has been lingering for a long time, and we seem not to be greening all these years that we've talked about it. There have been some modest gains, and as one of the contributors has put out there, I think it is important that we realize that COVID and the kind of shocks that we have suffered under COVID might be able to propel some forms of, will you say, leapfrogging when it comes to technologies and skills and knowledges that people need in order to practice, to go into practices that we consider to be green. Now, let's just take some examples. So if you take the example of agriculture, where for years we've been talking about adaptation, adaptations in a manner that will reduce the amount of energy that we use when it comes to developing countries, where older tractors from the 1970s are imported in here, where several small-scale farmers are graduating into medium-scale farmers, and therefore the use of all these equipments, right, compared to 20 decades ago, where it was mainly man and woman power being used on these farms. What kind of climate adaptation measures, right, can governments and NGOs, right, encourage that will make the agricultural sector at least less red or less brown? And I think these are not outside the reach of government. These are within the reach of government. So I think on the question of greening is about the kind of ambitions that communities and governments set for themselves that are realistic. Because right now we can talk about most developing country governments are financially stressed out. So for sure, there are certain measures which we all know are good for greening, which we do not expect to find happen because they just do not have the financial muscles to do that. However, we have the simple ones. We have sectors where we can encourage simple technologies and knowledges that can work. Now, go down to, I talked about the food industry, right? In the food industry, what do we have? The use of charcoal, the use of firewood, right? We can transform some of these areas. LPG and others. What are some of the simple policies that we need to do? Access to cylinders, access to the product. In many countries, you introduce LPG and it does not come, it comes occasionally. How do you want people to adopt the new technology if they don't even have access to it all the time? Why would government want to tax an area that they find useful for the environment? Right? So government policy becomes very critical. I mean, they have to choose between money in their pockets and the environment. You either tax the product and have fewer people use it and resort to the use of wood, right, which produces lots of smoke, which destroys, which creates deforestation, right, and all others. Now, also, but I think most of our success in greening, the green transition has been in terms of the automobile industry. And this, I mean, I would say for Ghana and other African countries, they have made very good strides in terms of taking out older vehicles, in terms of the fuel, the quality of fuel we have. And just to announce some good news is that in Ghana, because of COVID, because of the drop in fuel prices globally, all the OMCs, oil marketing companies, have brought in only lead-free, high-quality fuel that became accessible as a result of the drop in oil prices. And 3 of the companies have just announced that they are not going back to the old fuel. They are going to stay with the new fuel, and they are not going to increase prices. So this is good news, right? So I'll stop here.
Great, thank you very much. Good news indeed. It's good to hear something positive in these seminars. We tend to be a little, looking at the dark side of things. Bhaskar, would you like to very briefly comment and wrap up our discussion here?
Yeah, I'll try and be as short as I can. So, I mean, I just wanted to pick up on the community conservation question that was asked a little bit earlier. Very briefly, one of the observations, and I have a new project which is hopefully trying to look into this a little bit. A lot of the community conservation efforts were reliant on tourism. And one of the big impacts of the lockdown has been that international tourism certainly has come to a complete halt. So some of the ecotourism projects that were used to sustain community-based conservation in a revenue generating sense have found it impossible to keep up with some of their activities because tourist revenues have completely dried up over the last 6 months. So I just wanted to kind of, in a slightly more pessimistic way, talk about one of the unexpected downturns in that particular context. But again, an opportunity to reset what these community conservation projects are really doing and maybe reward them for not just generating tourism, but also for generating the investment in natural capital that these projects are intending to try and do. So maybe there's an opportunity here to revisit that tourism-centric model, which has been driving community conservation for a long time. Maybe one of the unfortunate side effects of that is the type of poaching incident that was reported from Nepal, which I hadn't heard about. I'm picking up very quickly Professor Sikka's question on the National Migrant Database and this issue. Yes, I mean, the scale of migration in India has been underdocumented, but was obviously known, but was certainly not visible in any sort of national database. I think my very quick response to that is that what is going to happen is that people will choose to migrate smaller distances. I think rather than going to the big urban settlements 1,000 kilometers away from their home village, they'll try and find jobs closer in district towns, in state capitals, which feel safer and closer in case, and the vulnerability that they've been exposed to has meant that the distant opportunities become less attractive because they just know how precarious their lives in those distant places are. That's just my instinct here. And then finally, just to conclude on the sort of green recovery, I think it's partly, and I think Professor Yaro has already indicated, this is about trying to use government's resources as productively as possible to try and stimulate some of those changes. We're in an unusual position because people expect government support for all sorts of recovery related activities. It gives government the ability to actually make some of those levels of financial support conditional on the kinds of transitions that you pointed to. So if the automobile sector requires support, can that be used to induce technological leapfrogging in the type that Professor Yaro has been talking about? So actually incentivize as well as pressurize some changes that we all know are required, but perhaps for a positive conclusion, use COVID's impacts as a way of forcing some of those changes to happen, rather than relying on businesses to do it spontaneously, to try and induce that change rather than allowing it to happen in a sort of more gradual way. So maybe this is that big leap that's needed.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bhaskar. This was very, very insightful. And I'm also very glad that we have ended on, a number of insights relating to technology, because our next seminar, which is next week, is going to focus precisely on that, right? So geographies of work in the pandemics and beyond, and the context is work and technology, both in the sense of, digital transitions mentioned by Pooja, and agricultural technology mentioned by Joseph and Bhaskar. So I really hope that you will all join us next week and the week after. I would like to thank our panelists for being here today. This is really fantastic to have you here. Thank you for devoting your time. Thank you to our audience, all of our participants who asked great questions. I do hope you will join us again next week. And with that, we say goodbye from Cambridge.
Thank you so much. Bye. Take care.